heavy stillness that enveloped the sacred air of the Chapel Royal on that historic morning was not disrupted by a loud argument or a sudden exclamation. Instead, it was shattered by the sharp, echoing friction of a wooden chair sliding backward against the stone floor. In full view of the highest-ranking members of the royal bloodline, the solemn clergy, seasoned courtiers, and a congregation completely stunned guests, Queen Camilla cast her eyes upon the official ceremonial seating arrangement. Upon realizing that Princess Charlotte had been positioned in a rank of precedence directly above her, she made an instantaneous, monumental decision that absolutely no one in the room could have anticipated. She rose deliberately from her designated place, turned her back on the pending religious service, and initiated a stern walkout, passing to the massive chapel doors before they could even be pulled shut by the attendants. The humiliation struck Camilla with immense force before anyone else in the sacred room could even put a name to the unfolding drama. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, and for one suspended heartbeat, the entire chapel seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see if she would submissively accept the lower position that had been mapped out for her. The Chapel Royal, an incredibly sacred and historic place of worship, reserved for the most intimate family milestones and private ceremonies, was far from being just a regular room within the palace walls. It was a chamber heavy with centuries of absolute history, rigid royal rank, and a silent code of behavior that every single person stepping inside was expected to instinctively respect and understand. Yet, on this particular afternoon, the message delivered by the protocol was unyielding and brutally clear. The Queen Consort of the United Kingdom had been seated in a position subordinate to a young princess, and the nature of this arrangement carried a precision that looked anything but accidental. Throughout the sudden movement, young Princess Charlotte remained perfectly still, shielded by her own youthful innocence, and yet enveloped by an adult tension that she could not fully comprehend. Her father, Prince William, however, perceived the situation with absolute clarity. The Prince of Wales knew better than anyone that seating charts at a royal event were never merely about physical comfort or where a person rested. They served as the ultimate visual declaration of what the palace hierarchy wanted the entire room to recognize. A ceremonial seating plan, which dictates the precise placement of every royal figure during a formal state function, possesses the power to speak volumes louder than any official speech ever could. It can bestow immense honor. It can subtly diminish a person's standing, and it can explicitly declare who represents the unstoppable future of the monarchy and who must learn to accept their assigned boundaries. King Charles froze instantly the moment he witnessed Camilla begin to move away from her row. In that initial, critical second, the monarch did not reach out to restrain her or patch over the moment, and that brief hesitation wounded his wife far more deeply than any public reprimand ever could. He understood the immense gravity of the religious service, yet he also read the raw emotion written across his wife's face as she actively retreated from the altar. She was not simply abandoning a physical chair. She was entirely rejecting an institutional verdict on her status. Prince William kept his gaze tightly controlled, observing every single micro-expression, because he knew his daughter's name was now positioned at the absolute center of a historic palace storm. When the chapel door finally clicked shut with a soft but definitive thud, the quietness that followed felt significantly louder than an angry shout. Courtiers immediately looked down at their program papers. Clergy members lowered their eyes to avoid awkward glances, and Catherine leaned in slightly closer to Charlotte. Her protective silence spoke volumes, safeguarding her young daughter, while the princess maintained her signature composure. Camilla's sudden departure had effectively transformed a private family service into a full-blown constitutional crisis before the very first prayer of the morning could even be uttered. To the casual onlookers who only witnessed the physical movement, it appeared to be an impulsive act of temper. But the underlying truth of this confrontation had been quietly brewing beneath the surface long before they arrived at the chapel gates. The empty chair in the front row was merely the final, visible symbol of a deep ideological struggle that had already fractured the relationships of the people closest to the British throne. After Camilla vanished into the long stone corridors, the atmosphere inside the chapel never truly recovered its dignity. The guests merely went through the motions of pretending everything was perfectly fine. Charles sat with rigid posture, his hands pressed tightly against his printed order of service, trying to maintain an illusion of control. William refused to look away from the altar, but every seasoned courtier in attendance knew the future king had analyzed every single detail of the slight. Princess Charlotte remained beautifully poised next to her parents, completely unaware of the political weight resting on her shoulders, while Catherine acted as a silent shield, protecting her child from an institutional battle she was never supposed to fight. Camilla had spent multiple decades navigating public scrutiny and internal palace warfare just to secure her legitimate place within the royal narrative. In one single, agonizing moment, that entire lifelong struggle seemed to dissolve into the reality of an empty seat. She had successfully outlasted public condemnation, intense family friction, and years of bitter whispers from critics. Yet, this institutional blow was entirely different because it occurred inside the inner sanctum of the monarchy itself. To be publicly placed beneath a young child was not a minor administrative error. It was a calculated institutional message wrapped in total silence, and every individual occupying those pews understood the underlying implications. Charlotte had never asked to be the catalyst for a royal crisis, nor had she ever spoken a single word against Camilla or claimed any sort of victory over her. The young girl had simply occupied the exact coordinate where the palace staff had directed her to go. That simplicity is precisely what rendered the moment so explosive. Her physical presence represented the unyielding future of the British crown and the direct line of succession that would sustain the monarchy long after the current interpersonal battles faded into history. Yet, her complete innocence provided no shield against the heavy weight of royal symbolism. Her name had been turned into a direct signal, and that signal had sliced straight through Camilla's hard-earned pride. King Charles could feel the long-term institutional damage settling heavily into the room around him. He recognized that his wife's public exit had deeply embarrassed his reign in front of the very individuals trained to spot the slightest crack in the royal facade. Furthermore, he was acutely aware that the specific seating blueprint had not been thrown together at the last minute. The ancient laws of royal protocol, which govern rank and ceremonial placement with absolute authority, had been executed with a calculated precision that was far too deliberate to be dismissed as a mistake. This realization trapped the king in a terrible paradox. If he rose to defend Camilla's honor too aggressively, he would be directly questioning the very palace authority that had approved the structural layout. Conversely, if he remained completely silent, he would be abandoning his wife to her own public humiliation. William understood this institutional trap perfectly, but his loyalty was anchored in a completely different direction. The Prince of Wales did not view Charlotte as a political pawn to be negotiated away for the sake of appearances. He saw her as his young daughter, who was being unfairly dragged into an adult dispute. He was entirely determined that she would never become the scapegoat for Camilla's wounded pride, and he would not allow anyone to imply that his child had assumed a status that was not rightfully hers. Catherine sensed that fierce paternal resolve beside her, and her own external calm became sharper, colder, and infinitely more protective as the service continued. It was during this tense atmosphere that Catherine noticed a subtle shift. A senior royal aide near the front pews lowered his gaze the exact moment Charles scanned the room. The gesture was fleeting, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but revealed everything. The controversial seating order had been discussed behind closed doors long before this morning, debated intensely, and ultimately authorized at the highest levels of the palace infrastructure. The attendant who gently secured the chapel door after Camilla's exit did so with extreme care, but the sound echoed to the minds of the congregation like a final judgment. No one dared to speak because every single individual within the chapel royal interpreted the walkout through the lens of their own stakes. To Camilla, it was an unforgivable insult. To Charles, it was a public relations disaster. To William, it was a boundary line that had finally been established. And to Catherine, it was a distinct danger closing around her daughter's well-being. To fully comprehend why a single chair carried such immense geopolitical weight, the narrative must examine the private, highly charged moments that transpired weeks prior. The true origin of this crisis did not materialize within the chapel. It ignited during an intimate, private dinner at Windsor Castle, where a single, sharp sentence completely altered the emotional temperature of the family. The intense corporate silence that followed the private disagreement at Windsor Castle did not simply evaporate. It solidified into an official palace decree that set the stage for the chapel explosion. In the immediate aftermath of that fateful dinner, where Camilla had directly questioned Charlotte's elevated ceremonial position. A written memorandum was meticulously drafted within the upper chambers of the household staff. This document, which officially confirmed Princess Charlotte's strict precedence for the upcoming Chapel Royal service, effectively converted a tense family argument into a permanent palace directive. The wording of the note did not scream, nor did it contain any overt accusations against anyone's honor, but it fixed the young princess's coordinates in writing with a legalistic finality that made the upcoming confrontation inevitable. When King Charles received the specific administrative note in his private study, he did not immediately sign it, nor did he issue a counterorder to relocate his wife to a higher row. He simply read the paragraphs once, then scanned them a second time with a heavy sigh, and placed the document face down on his desk without offering a single word of commentary. However, within the ancient mechanics of the British monarchy, an absolute silence from the reigning sovereign does not signal neutrality. It serves as a powerful form of institutional permission. By actively refusing to intervene and reverse the structural plan, the king allowed the controversial seating chart to stand as the definitive rule of the day. Camilla was left entirely in the dark, destined to discover the final logistical arrangement only when she arrived at the pews, at a moment when it was already far too late to demand an alteration without creating an even larger public spectacle. From that exact second, the Chapel Royal was no longer just preparing to host a traditional morning service. It was transformed into a ticking clock waiting for an inevitable clash of egos. Once Camilla crossed the threshold of the chapel and realized the depth of the institutional slight, her retreat into the private outer corridors did not signify the end of her anger, but rather the beginning of a much larger administrative storm. Behind the heavy, soundproof wooden barriers and away from the staring eyes of the congregation, the raw humiliation she had suppressed inside the sanctuary immediately erupted into furious, whispered confrontations. King Charles had followed her out of the room after a brief, painful delay, but his arrival was far too late to erase the profound damage that had already been inflicted upon her pride. When Prince William stepped into the exact same corridor only a few moments later, the physical atmosphere between the three royals became significantly sharper, colder, and entirely impossible to write off as a mere case of hurt feelings. Camilla turned toward the king with the accumulated resentment of someone who felt she had carried the heavy burden of public insult for decades, only to find her ultimate position inside the family actively undermined by the palace's own inner circle. Her voice did not rise into a scream at first, but rather trembled with a concentrated intensity that made the words feel far more dangerous to the stability of the room. The queen consort explicitly stated to Monarch that being deliberately positioned below a child did not feel like a standard adherence to tradition or a routine application of ancient protocol. To her, it felt intricately designed, a calculated maneuver explicitly engineered to force her to understand, in front of the entire household, that her status could be lowered whenever the administrative powers of the palace deemed it necessary. Charles attempted to soothe her with quiet explanations, but his words came out haltingly and lacked conviction, because even he recognized that the walkout had amplified the crisis far beyond the physical boundaries of a chair. The king desperately reminded her that walking away from an active royal service was an unprecedented breach of duty, emphasizing that the Chapel Royal was not just a simple place of prayer, but a highly symbolic institutional theater, where every public gesture was read as either absolute loyalty or open defiance. Camilla, however, refused to soften her stance, countering that the true institutional defiance had occurred when the advisors allowed Charlotte's name to outrank hers without offering a single honest warning before the doors opened. Before the king could formulate a defense to repair the breaking trust, Prince William stepped forward into the conversation, his external calm carrying far more weight than any emotional outburst. The Prince of Wales told Camilla directly and without hesitation that Charlotte had taken absolutely nothing from her standing, and that his young daughter had never actively reached for a higher rank or demanded special recognition from the staff. He maintained that the princess had simply sat exactly where the crown had officially commanded her to be, using the term crown to invoke the supreme authority of the monarchy as an institution that transcended personal family dynamics. William's tone remained completely steady, but underneath his polite vocabulary sat a razor-sharp warning that his children would never be utilized as shields to protect the pride of adults. Camilla looked directly into her stepson's eyes and delivered a question that seemed to freeze the air in the corridor, asking him outright if he had personally approved the layout. William did not blink, nor did he offer a polite apology or an easy way out of the confrontation. His absolute silence and unyielding stance provided the definitive answer she feared. This was not an administrative oversight by a junior secretary, nor was an old rule mistakenly applied by an outdated computer system. It was a direct head-on collision between the king's marriage vows and the rigid future of the line of succession. Charles looked back and forth between his defensive wife and his unbending son, feeling the immense weight of his own powerlessness settle into his chest, realizing that where Camilla saw absolute betrayal, William saw absolute duty. This corridor confrontation stripped away the palace's ability to hide behind the comfortable excuse of tradition, forcing the family to confront the reality of who truly wielded the administrative power behind the throne. In the hours that followed the disastrous service, the true nature of the conspiracy became undeniable when the physical proof was unveiled in a secure office within the palace walls. William stood firmly beside a large wooden table, while a senior courtier slowly unfolded the master seating chart, which was heavily marked with official annotations. Charles stared down at Charlotte's name typed neatly in the primary position, with Camilla's designation explicitly placed beneath it, realizing that the arrangement had been vetted by multiple hands that understood the precise symbolic weight of every single line. William remained silent for several minutes, allowing the visual evidence to speak for itself, and making the room feel increasingly hazardous for anyone attempting to draft a false excuse. The prince had already defended his daughter's position in the heat of the corridor, but here, within the quiet confines of the administrative office, all emotion had been entirely removed, leaving behind nothing but the cold reality of a calculated institutional strategy. The seating plan had been deliberately shaped around the direct line of succession, ensuring that the physical layout of the chapel mirrored the future path through which the British crown would inevitably pass. Charles felt a profound sense of exposure as he stared at the marked sheet, knowing exactly how Camilla would react when she discovered that this layout was not a random occurrence, but a deeply reviewed policy. She would not accept complex explanations about historical continuity or constitutional symbolism. She would view it as a total abandonment by the husband she had defended through decades of public storm. This was the true tragedy of the moment for the monarch, trapped perfectly between the emotional needs of his marriage and the unyielding demands of the institution he had inherited. William's resolve did not soften even a fraction as the meeting progressed, and he made it absolutely clear that his daughter's dignity was an unnegotiable asset that would never be traded away to suit the fragile egos of older generations. The future king understood that once Charlotte's position had been openly questioned at Windsor, the palace administration had to respond with a definitive statement of authority, rather than a weak gesture of appeasement. It was at this moment that the senior courtier confirmed the worst fears of the king, admitting that the permanent change of the chart had been officially authorized immediately after the private Windsor dinner. The official did not sensationalize the revelation, but his calm explanation connected the dinner argument directly to the chapel chair, and the chair directly to the public walkout, creating an unbroken chain of cause and consequence that pointed back to the moment Camilla had chosen to challenge the child's placement. When Catherine was shown the same marked document later that afternoon, her legendary composure nearly shattered under the weight of maternal protective instinct. She touched her daughter's typed name with a gentle finger, seeing her not as a grand historical symbol of succession, but as an innocent little girl who had been pushed into the front lines of an adult political war she never asked to join. Catherine understood the constitutional future William was defending, but she also saw the immense risk the palace was taking by converting a child's chair into a battlefield for adult pride. What had begun as a simple disagreement over a wooden seat had now transformed into a deep, jagged crack running to the absolute center of the royal household. By the arrival of the late evening hours, the absolute silence that gripped the royal quarters was no longer a sign of peace, but the quiet, heavy breath of an empire trying to control a leaking leak. The polished doors of the family apartments closed with soft clicks, and seasoned aides moved along the stone floors with lowered voices, carrying sensitive updates by hand rather than risking the standard internal messaging systems. Queen Camilla sat entirely isolated within the dim lighting of a private sitting room, still draped in the elegant formal garments she had selected with such high expectations for the chapel royal morning service. Outside her door, King Charles stood motionless for several long seconds, his hand hovering over the handle, paralyzed by the realization that neither of them possessed the words to roll the clock back to the start of the day. When the monarch finally stepped inside, Camilla refused to raise her eyes immediately, using that brief stretch of silence to punish him before a single verbal accusation could be made. The queen consort had survived brutal periods of global media hostility in her life, but this internal humiliation cut deeper because the wound had been engineered inside the secure parameter of her own family. She had not been reduced by the pens of hostile journalists. She had been systematically outranked by the silent ink of a palace seating plan that her husband had ultimately allowed to pass into law. Charles felt the invisible weight of that accusation before she even opened her mouth, knowing that his senior public relations teams were already scrambling to contain the fallout before the narrative completely dominated the morning broadcasts. Within the constitutional framework of Great Britain, a public walkout from a sacred service cannot be smoothed over as a minor domestic squabble. It stands as a visible fracture in the dignity of the crown itself. Camilla finally looked up, her voice trembling not with a scream of temper, but with the painful disbelief of someone who had been left to discover her lower status in front of the very courtiers she was supposed to lead. Charles answered with his own heavy heart, stating that by choosing to exit the chapel so dramatically, she had turned a private administrative grievance into an international public scandal that no amount of spin could easily cover up. Outside the palace gates, the media machinery was already moving with terrifying speed, converting the image of the single empty chair into a national symbol of a family divided over its own future. By the next dawn, major newspapers displayed the stark wooden pews under heavy titles declaring the event as the exact moment the unstoppable future of the monarchy had outranked its present state. Catherine, observing the rapid escalation of her daughter's name across the rolling news screens, felt the ancient protective instincts of motherhood harden within her soul. The Princess of Wales understood with absolute clarity that while the public praise of Charlotte's calm behavior sounded flattering, it was highly dangerous to allow a young child to be framed as the victor in an adult battle for power. She explicitly requested that Charlotte be entirely removed from all future scheduling debates, ensuring her daughter would never be utilized by palace officials as an apology or an explanation for the wounded pride of senior adults. The final resolution of the day, however, could not be found within press statements, but behind the closed doors of a private room where Charles and William faced each other without aides, secretaries, or diplomatic language to soften the blows. The king desperately wanted to repair the immediate domestic wound, but the future king refused to yield a single inch of ground, reinforcing the baseline principle that Charlotte's generational rank was a permanent constitutional reality that would never be diminished to make older generations feel more secure. Charles looked away in the quietness of the room, recognizing that his son's unyielding stance was not driven by malice, but by the cold, necessary duty of protecting the long-term line of succession. No official apology was ever issued for the seating arrangement, and the palace ultimately released a short, controlled statement emphasizing continuity and generational duty. Yet, as the noise of the weekend finally began to fade into history, the empty chair inside the Chapel Royal remained etched in the public consciousness as an unspoken verdict. It proved to the world that while Camilla had successfully secured her title, the administrative reality of the future crown belonged to a new generation that did not need to fight for its place, because it was already written in stone. Thank you for watching this deep analysis into the inner workings of the palace. Please do not forget to hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel for more exclusive insights, and we will see you in the next video.